what I want to talk to you about is diversity. And what you see on the slide is my team, and that's what we do. We look at diversity research. And when you talk about diversity, people come up with these sort of stereotypical images, which you see here on this slide, and they seem to come from one designer's office only. I mean, they all look very similar. They all look the same to me, as if one sort of organization sort of shapes our idea how we should look at diversity. And if you look at the slide, you will see that the top one has a bunch of people in it, and they're all thin, and they're all white, and they're all young, and they're all healthy. And I'm sure that somebody said, that's not diversity. Let's put some people of color. Let's put in some people who are Muslims by the look of it. And then they add on more people: fat people, small people, old people, persons in a wheelchair. And then they make it so broad that you think, okay, they want to be all inclusive, but it doesn't really say anything. It stays the same sort of abstract idea of what diversity is. And the other image you get when you look at all these websites that have been created around the theme of diversity is this dehumanizing type of image where you have colored umbrellas, waves, little pencils or dices of all colors. Not people. So it is apparently about color and less about people. So that's what we look at, the stereotyping when it comes to diversity. And the surprising thing is that although we as researchers talk a lot about intersectionality, so that it should be not only about color or about ethnicity or about culture, but it should be about class and gender and sexuality and ability and language, etc., etc., the talks about diversity very often focus on what is called ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, or perhaps race. And class, which is key to talks about diversity, is this sort of ghost concept. People don't talk about class, although it's there in the background continuously. It does make a difference when people talk about diversity if you're lower class or upper class. It does make a difference to the chances you have within society, etc., etc. So class is this ghost concept. Religion very often comes up as Islam and only Islam. So there's apparently no talk about other religions. And then gender is talked about in this dichotomy of at risk and a risk. And so the dichotomy between women being at risk, at risk of becoming trafficked, at risk of becoming dominated by man, at risk when it comes to the work they do or the position they're in. So it's very much women who are at risk and the men who are a risk. And so one letter difference, but it's very different perception of what gender is, but it's about risk and not about anything else. And sexuality, and this is what you see on the slide here, comes up as Twitter diversity. One day a year, somebody, an organization, a municipality, national authorities raise this coming out flag or rainbow flag and say, oh yeah, we do deal with sexuality. One day a year, and the rest of the year we ignore it. And so this is the Twitter diversity. Put it on Twitter, put it on X, and say, okay, we've done what we should do. Let's move on doing something else. So what I did first was talking about diversity, singular, and then I started to talk about diversities, plural, and now I start to talk about super diversity. So this is a term that Steven Wertevec introduced in 2007, and the surprising thing is that this caught on very, very rapidly. Everybody started to use this concept of super diversity, and very often it wasn't meant to say that this is super. It wasn't meant to say something positive as a rule. But municipalities caught on to this concept as, oh yeah, this is where the society is currently. It's a super diverse society. And when it comes to firms, companies, factories, they often present this as an asset. Saying things like, yeah, if we have a team which consists of white, old men only, it's not a good team. It's not strong, it's not creative. We should have a more diversity. But if you look at it from the perspective of, for instance, a municipal government, they see super diversity as a problem. Oh dear, we have to juggle now all these forms of diversity at the same time. Society is so complicated, we don't know what to do anymore. And so it's sort of not a positive thing when it comes to policies and policy implementations. And what you also see when you look at this concept of superdiversity and how it's used is that it's a way to problematize today's society via deproblematizing the past, sort of ignoring the diversities that existed in the past and homogenizing groups that existed in the past. Saying things, for instance, like guest worker migrants, denying the fact that they came from several countries, 8, 9, 10 countries, and that within these countries there was a very nice diversity also. I mean, there were people from the south of Italy who didn't like the people from the north of Italy. There were people from supporting the Turkish regime or opposing the Turkish regime. Denying the diversity within these groups is sort of saying, okay, and this was unproblematic, the past was unproblematic, but today we have all these forms of diversity, and that's difficult. And the other thing that you see, and that is also what you see on the slide, is that the world we've lost, the world of the 1950s or the 1960s, which you see here, 2 women sitting on a bench with their prams, is idolized. This was the good society. And now we've moved to a society which is complicated, to say the least. And I just mentioned Steve Vertevec and his idea of introducing this concept in 2007. But before him, in the 1980s, you had Robert Putnam. And Putnam introduced the concept of social cohesion being threatened by diversity. And so he came up with this idea that too much diversity is going to be a problem for societies, and that it leads to an incoherent society, and that's a problem. And his idea was debunked quite fast after he first introduced it, but it continued to influence policymakers at great length. And so what you see is that they continue to present diversity as a threat to social cohesion endlessly. And so this is surprising. Although the idea was debunked, policymakers kept using it. And so we're not a cohesive society anymore because we have too much diversity. And the interesting thing is that we can't sort of say, nobody says how to measure social cohesion, nor how to measure too much diversity. So it's interesting. So what we do in the project is that we look at these terms, for instance, diversity policies. And then if you look at this term diversity policies, you'll see that people will say, yeah, we didn't have a diversity officer until 10 years ago. So this is new. Yeah, diversity policies is new. Maybe to some measure, a diversity officer is definitely something of the last 10 years, but attention to diversity, especially if you include the other forms of diversity I mentioned, like class, is nothing new in itself. And so there has been diversity policies, but it's not named like that. People don't call it diversities, but they are diversity policies, only the name changes over time. And if you look at, for instance, what you see on the slide here, is I did a newspaper analysis, seeing how the term diversity was used over time. And you do see that in the 1970s already, there is an increased attention to diversity, meaning cultural and ethnic diversity mostly, and that it sort of spills out of control in the 1980s, when this becomes the key concept of discussion. So what we do when we study this diversity, we look at policy papers. And so we look at what authorities, national authorities, local authorities write down on paper saying, okay, this is what we think diversity policy should look like. We look at what the media do, because that's very important when it comes to diversity. We look at the material organizations have produced. We also look at interviews and protests, people who protest against measures that are introduced to either increase social cohesion or to protest a lack of social cohesion, whatever that may be. There is an author, Sarah Ahmed, and she has introduced this concept of doing diversity. So doing diversity is this thing that we're looking at, diversity policies meeting practices. So how is what's set on paper implemented, put into practice? And which choices do the implementers make, and which room do they have to maneuver when they want to implement diversity policies? And like I said, these policies are meant to enhance social cohesion. So diversity as a concept is very much connected to this concept of social cohesion. And what you see is very often that people say it failed, the policies failed, without having any indication on, well, how to measure that success or failure, or the social cohesion. But the idea that these policies are failing is important because it sort of undermines the trust in democracy. You have a whole big state apparatus doing all this diversity and then not getting any results. And without debating that you maybe not be able to measure that, they debate the fact that, yeah, it failed. And so you have a very critical stance to it. The picture you see here is a very nice picture which illustrates a point I want to make, and that is, here you see three men there standing behind a fence, and the tall man is standing on a crate, but he actually doesn't need it. The middle one does need a crate to see over the fence. The small one is also standing on a crate, but he doesn't need the crate because he doesn't see anything anyhow, on the crate or not on the crate. And the second one illustrates equity. So the first one illustrates equality, the second one illustrates equity, where the tall person doesn't have a crate, the middle one does have a crate, and the smaller one does have two crates. So now all of them can see over the fence. And the third one is that you remove the fence. Why do we have the fence in the first place? I mean, why is the fence there? That's liberation. And then the last one is they're also participating in what's behind the fence. I mean, why are they spectators? Why are they not involved in what was behind the fence to begin with? And that's inclusion. And what's important now is that when it comes to diversity policies, and what I want to finish with, is that in order to be inclusive, to provide, in fact, equality, you have to treat people differently. And this goes against this idea that everybody is equal and should have the same treatment. And what I want to claim is they shouldn't.